Saving Sunday dripping to fry Monday's bread, soaking split peas overnight so the pot cooked itself while you were at the mill, wrapping offal in caul fat so nothing was lost. These women had solved problems food scientists are still explaining. Here are 30 banned British kitchen secrets that scientists now say were genius. The smell hit you before you got to the kitchen. It was a deep, savoury warmth that meant the dripping tin had been brought out and someone was about to do something useful with it. Dripping, collected from the Sunday roasting tin and left to cool until the fat went white and the dark jelly settled at the bottom, was spread thick on plain white bread, salted and eaten while still warm from the grill. The dark layer underneath, the solidified meat juices, was the part the knowledgeable ones went for first. It tasted of the roast itself, intensified and concentrated, and you could tell a great deal about the quality of a Sunday dinner from the quality of its dripping. During rationing, bread and dripping was not a poverty substitute. It was a deliberate act of kitchen logic that wasted nothing. The fat rendered from the meat went back into the week's cooking, into the pan for frying, spread on bread for breakfast, rubbed over vegetables before roasting. Today, it is sold in artisan delis under the name beef tallow. In those kitchens, it was just what you did with the tin. You either knew what tripe was, or you flinched, and the flinching told the old cooks everything they needed to know about you. Tripe, the stomach lining of cattle, came in two main forms in British butchers: smooth tripe from the first stomach, and honeycomb tripe from the second, the latter preferred in the north of England for its texture and its ability to hold sauce in the pockets of its surface. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, tripe and onions meant the cleaned stomach simmered slowly in milk with sliced onions and white pepper for an hour or more, until the tripe went tender and the milk reduced to a thin, savoury sauce. The preparation was everything. Badly cleaned tripe had a smell that followed you. Properly cleaned and long cooked, tripe had a soft, yielding texture and absorbed the onion and pepper completely. The women who made it knew the difference before it went in the pot, by running a thumb along the surface. You did not measure the milk. You poured until it looked right. Nobody explained this to you. You watched until you understood it yourself. Monday morning, before anyone else was up, the kitchen was already producing something from nothing. Bubble and squeak was the leftover vegetables of Sunday dinner: potato, cabbage, carrot, whatever had made it to the table the day before, mashed together, pressed into a flat cake and fried in a hot pan until both sides went dark and crisp. The name came from the sound it made, the bubble of the fat, the squeak of the water in the vegetables, and every kitchen that made it knew the noise meant it was nearly ready. You pressed the cake down firmly with the back of a spatula to increase the contact surface. What started as Monday salvage became something people specifically looked forward to. The leftover was better than the original, crispier, denser. The flavours of the whole Sunday dinner compressed into one dark-edged disc. It disappeared when Sunday dinners stopped producing enough leftovers to make it worth starting the pan. Queen Elizabeth I ate brawn. So did every household in Britain for the 4 centuries that followed, until the 1960s when somebody decided that cooking a pig's head was a step too far. Brawn, called potted hide in Scotland and pork cheese in Yorkshire and parts of Norfolk, was made by simmering the whole head in water with bay leaves, peppercorns, vinegar and onion for 3 to 4 hours until the meat fell from the bone. The meat was picked, the gelatinous liquor was strained and reduced, and everything was pressed into a bowl or tureen to set overnight. It was dense, richly seasoned, sliced thin, and served with sharp English mustard and bread. The head yielded more edible meat than almost any other part of the pig: cheek, tongue, ear, and the soft flesh around the jaw, and the natural collagen set the whole thing without gelatine. Households that knew what to do with it were giving their families something extraordinary. Both kinds of knowledge vanished around the same time. Before the health campaigns of the 1980s warned households about saturated fat, every kitchen kept a dripping basin, an enamel bowl or earthenware pot on the larder shelf, holding the rendered fat from every joint that had come through that week. Beef dripping toast meant slicing bread, toasting it under the grill, and spreading the dripping while the toast was still hot enough to melt it slightly, then a pinch of salt, sometimes pepper, and nothing else. Toast was simple, and it relied entirely on heat and timing. The best dripping came from a long-roasted joint and had enough meat juices settled through it to be almost savoury on its own. You could tell where you were in the week by the dripping. Early in the week, clean and white. By Friday, darkened and deepened with each pan tipped into it. Best dripping carried the memory of every roast into the next meal. The women who ran these kitchens tasted the dripping the way a cook now tastes stock. Nobody saves dripping now. That whole system of accumulated flavour, the week's cooking giving back to the week's cooking, just stopped. Rabbit was the one meat the Ministry of Food never rationed, because it ran wild across the British countryside and could be caught or snared without a butcher. In working-class households from the 1930s through the 1950s, rabbit stew was a regular presence. It was jointed, browned in dripping, and simmered with onion, carrot, pearl barley and stock until the meat fell from the thin bones. The flavour was mild and clean, and it took on the vegetables and herbs completely. The legs and back gave the most meat, and the rib cage stayed in the pot for flavour and came out before serving. A good rabbit fed a family of 4 for almost nothing. Myxomatosis hit in 1953 and killed an estimated 95% of Britain's wild rabbit population within 2 years. By the time numbers recovered, the generation that had cooked rabbit regularly had moved on, and the habit never came back. The knowledge of how to joint one cleanly went with it. In the brown paper bags on the harbour side at Morecambe, the shrimps were still warm from the boiling, tiny, pink-shelled, caught in the shallow waters of the bay by trawls that went out at low tide and came back in time for breakfast. The potted shrimp technique had been practiced on that coast since at least the 18th century. Peeled shrimps stirred into clarified butter seasoned with mace, cayenne and nutmeg, packed into small pots and sealed with a final butter layer that kept them fresh for weeks without refrigeration. The boiling water for Morecambe Bay shrimps was always salted with seawater, a detail specific to that coast that local potters considered non-negotiable, and London recipe books never mentioned. Ian Fleming ate potted Morecambe Bay shrimps regularly at his London club and considered them among the finest things the British table produced. The shrimp fleet has dwindled, the bay overfished, and shrimp sold under the Morecambe Bay label now come from the North Sea. The old potters would have tasted the difference in the first mouthful. On the day the bread was baked, always the same day each week, the oven already hot and the lard already out, the baker saved a portion of the risen dough and made lardy cake. Rendered pig lard, soft brown sugar and mixed dried fruit were layered into the dough by rolling, folding and re-rolling 3 times. The same lamination technique used in flaky pastry, then baked in a tin at high heat until the top went dark gold and the kitchen filled with a smell that had no equivalent. What came out was rich, sweet, faintly chewy and good in a way that surprised anyone who had not grown up with it. The dish was specific to Wiltshire and the surrounding counties, where pig farming made lard a kitchen constant. Elizabeth David recorded the recipe from a Hampshire bakery in the 1960s, noting that the weekly baking cycle was inseparable from the dish. Lardy cake only happened when the bread was being made. Removed from that rhythm, it became just a recipe. Something in the flavour went with the ritual. The haybox was not a metaphor. It was a wooden or cardboard box packed with hay, old newspapers, or a feather pillow, and it was one of the most intelligent cooking tools the British kitchen ever produced. Bring whatever you are cooking to a hard boil on the hob, seal the pot, transfer it into the haybox for several hours, and the retained heat finished the cooking without any further fuel. Stews, porridge, soups, and dried beans all worked perfectly. The Ministry of Food promoted the Haybox in its wartime food flash films as a means of reducing coal and gas consumption, demonstrating it in church halls across the country through the 1940s. Some households used old gas mask carriers packed with newspaper, which cost nothing to build and nothing to run. Food scientists studying retained heat cooking have since confirmed it produces more tender results in certain cuts than conventional stovetop cooking. The women using hayboxes in the 1940s already knew this, not from science but from the pot. Nobody who grew up in those kitchens thinks of the OXO cube as a shortcut. It was a tool, the way a sharp knife is a tool, and the women who knew how to use it produced results with it that had nothing to do with the instant gravy it later became. A single cube dissolved in a mug of boiling water was the drink given to children who were cold, to workers coming in from the garden, to anyone who needed something warm and savoury without a meal behind it. Crumbled dry into a stew, it deepened the colour and added a layer of roasted beef flavour that took hours to develop from scratch. Bovril, the beef extract paste in the brown jar, worked the same way, dissolved in hot water for drinking, spread thin on toast, stirred into gravy at the last minute when it needed lifting. The rule was that you added it toward the end and never let it boil, because boiling drove off the volatile compounds that gave it depth. This was not in any instruction. You learned it from the kitchen. You knew it when you tasted the difference. Long before the faggot reached the school dinner counter and was rejected by a generation of children, it was serious kitchen craft. Named from the French word for a bundle, and first printed in the Manchester Courier in June 1843, the traditional faggot was made from minced pig offal, liver, heart, lungs, and fat belly pork, seasoned with onion, sage, salt, and white pepper, then wrapped in caul fat, the lacy membrane from around the pig's stomach that held everything together during baking, and basted it as the fat melted. Baked in a tray with a little stock, the caul crisped at the edges, and the meat inside stayed dense and moist. Alongside it came peas pudding, split yellow peas simmered in a cloth, until soft enough to mash with butter and pepper into a thick golden paste. The combination was specific to the north and east of England. You could tell where a cook was from by how she seasoned her faggots, the sage, the nutmeg, the grind. No two women made them identically. That individuality is gone now. Along the Roman road and through Bethnal Green, the Jellied eel shops stood at regular intervals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, white-tiled and marble-countered, with eel in one form or another always available. The eel was chopped into rounds, boiled in water with vinegar, salt, bay, and fresh herbs until just cooked, then left to cool in its own cooking liquor, which set solid as it chilled, not from added gelatine, but from the natural collagen in the eel's skin and bones. By the end of the Second World War, there were over 100 jellied eel shops in East London. By 2024, that number had fallen to 34. The flavour is clean and cold and slightly sharp from the vinegar, with a texture that separates immediately into firm fish and yielding jelly. You ate it from a small white bowl with a small wooden fork and a shake of white pepper, standing at the counter or sitting at one of the 4 small tables. Nobody explained it to visitors. Either you understood it or you left it. The regulars who understood it grew old. Their children did not come back. Before the cereal box arrived on the breakfast table, the deviled kidney was the thing that separated a kitchen that knew what it was doing from one that did not. Lamb's kidneys, halved, the white core cut cleanly away with the point of a small knife. A detail most modern recipes skip, and then wonder why the flavour turns bitter, were tossed in a hot pan with butter, cayenne, English mustard powder, and a sharp dash of Worcestershire sauce until the outside went dark and the inside stayed just pink. They were served on thick buttered toast before the rest of the household was dressed. The dish had been on Victorian breakfast tables since the 1700s, eaten by those who could afford kidneys and those who could not alike, because kidneys cost almost nothing at the butcher's counter. The trick was the heat, too low, and they stewed and toughened, too high, and the outside scorched before the inside was done. You watched the colour change and learned the timing by ruining a few batches. Today they appear on the odd gastropub menu as a curiosity. In those kitchens they were just Wednesday. It cost almost nothing. The trotter, the butcher, practically gave them away because nobody else wanted them, which was exactly the point. You got them home, singed off any remaining hairs over the gas flame, then covered them in cold water with an onion, peppercorns, bay, and a slug of vinegar, and brought them to a very slow simmer. Hours passed. 3 hours, sometimes 4. The collagen from the bones and skin dissolved into the liquid, and this was the secret that food scientists are now selling as a luxury under the name bone broth. The meat, when it finally released, was silky and rich, served with a sharp mustard, or pressed cold into a bowl where it set in its own jelly. In the 1950s and 60s, trotter jelly was the gelatin that set the brawn, enriched the pork pie filling, and gave body to any stew that needed it. The women who made this knew instinctively how much collagen a batch of trotters would yield by the feel of the stock on their fingertip, press and release, and if it pulled slightly, it was ready. That test was never in a recipe. You learned it from her, and then she was gone. If you weren't from the Black Country, you would never have heard of it, and if you were, you didn't need it explained. Groaty Dick is fatty stewing beef, leeks, onions, beef stock and groats, pearl barley's rougher, older cousin. Groats were often bought from the pet shop in Wolverhampton because the grocer did not stock them and nobody bothered to ask why. Everything went into a pot, the lid went on, and it went into the oven overnight at a low heat, 14, sometimes 16 hours, until the groats had absorbed every drop of stock and the beef had collapsed into the grain. A red oxo cube, a dried bay leaf and black pepper were the only seasonings most families used. Keith Floyd, filming in a Wolverhampton kitchen in the 1980s, was taught the dish by a woman named Joan, who wore her best pearls for the occasion and told him plainly it did not look very appetizing, but that most people would eat it. She was right on both counts. The dish is still made in Black Country households, though finding groats outside the area requires the kind of determination the recipe was always built on. On the 5th of November in Lancashire, before the bonfire was lit and the parkin was cut, there were the black peas, carling peas, dried and dark, soaked overnight and then simmered for hours until tender but still whole, served in paper cups or old mugs with salt, a knob of butter, and sometimes a splash of malt vinegar, eaten outside in the cold while the sparks went up. Not mushy peas, not grey peas. Carling peas are a variety distinct to the north of England, with an earthier, nuttier flavour that nobody who grew up with them ever confuses with anything else. The tradition was embedded in the Lancashire calendar, the way parkin and treacle toffee were, specific, unquestioned, passed from street to street without anyone writing it down or explaining it to people from elsewhere. You stood outside your nan's house holding a warm cup, smelling wood smoke, and that was bonfire night. The carling pea has mostly vanished from the shops now, and with it, the specific smell of that cup on a cold night, which is not really the pea's story to tell, but your nan's. When the sugar ration in wartime Britain fell to 8 ounces per person per week, the Ministry of Food issued a leaflet that told housewives to use carrots, not as a metaphor, but literally as a sweetener in cakes, puddings, biscuits and jams. Carrots contain enough natural sugar to do the work when the real thing runs out. The Ministry's archives, now held by the Imperial War Museum, include a carrot sponge pudding recipe from the 1940s, that produces a genuinely sweet, moist result with no refined sugar at all. Parsnips worked similarly and were sweeter still. Beetroot gave colour and a dense, dark sweetness to chocolate-style cakes. These were not compromises that tasted of desperation. They were genuine solutions, stumbled onto through necessity and then quietly perfected over 4 years of making do. Food scientists now study the Maillard reaction in root vegetables with considerable enthusiasm. The women standing in those Ministry of Food queues got there first, without the equipment or the language, just the problem and the carrot. In the back of the larder, behind the marmite and the dripping tin, there were always the small glass jars, potted meat, fish paste, bloater paste, each one sealed under a thin layer of clarified butter or wax. Shipham's paste in a flat little pot. A jar of potted beef from the butcher, dark and dense and seasoned with mace and allspice. Bloater paste made from smoked herring, the fish from Yarmouth, reduced and blended with butter until it spread cleanly on a thin slice of white bread. These were the preserved proteins of the working larder, the things that kept for weeks without refrigeration, that went into sandwiches in a packed lunch without fuss, that stretched a Sunday joint into Monday's tea. The technique, cooking meat or fish in fat, seasoning, potting and sealing, is the same one chefs now call rillettes and sell for £12 a portion. In those kitchens, it was just the Tuesday sandwich. The jar sat in the larder, the butter seal kept everything good, and nobody called it a preservation technique. It was just what was in the cupboard. During the Second World War, around 2,000 establishments called British restaurants opened in school halls, church halls, and empty shops across the country. They were run by local councils, required no ration coupons, and served a plain 3-course meal for 9 pence, roast dinner, stew and pudding, and hot sweet tea. The cooking depots in Sheffield and Plymouth prepared hundreds of portions a day for workers, bombed out families, and anyone who could not stretch their rations far enough that week. They were not elegant. The Windsor soup was watery, the gravy occasionally thin, the puddings uniform. But they were warm, and they were there, run by women who had volunteered or been conscripted into the kitchen and who kept the service going through 6 years of war. After 1945, most of them closed quietly. The women who ran them went back to their own kitchens, took nothing from the experience publicly, and were never mentioned in the official histories of the war effort. The food they made fed a significant portion of the country. Nobody put a plaque up. The argument about black pudding was never about the pudding itself. It was about where you were from and whether you understood the difference. In Stornoway, on the Isle of Lewis, black pudding is made with a high proportion of oatmeal and beef suet, giving it a coarser, earthier texture the island considers non-negotiable. In Lancashire, the pudding runs darker and fattier, the oatmeal a background note. In the Midlands, some butchers added onion and barley. Every version used fresh pig's blood collected on killing day and worked immediately before it set, seasoned with salt, white pepper, and a spice combination the butcher kept to himself. The casing was natural gut, filled without air pockets and tied at intervals. The test was pressing the finished pudding gently with one finger. The right firmness came from the blood-to-fat ratio, and the old butchers could feel it before cutting. Supermarket black pudding uses dried blood powder and standardized blends. The regional butchers who made it properly are fewer every decade, and when the last one in a town closes, that town's version goes with them. Dig for Victory was a government instruction. But the women who ran the allotments had been foraging the hedgerows long before Whitehall suggested it. Young nettles, the top 4 leaves only, picked in spring before they flower, were handled with gloves and plunged into boiling water to destroy the sting. They made a soup as dark and deep as spinach and as rich in iron as anything from a tin. Elderflower heads went into cordial. Blackberries became jam without sugar, set with apple pectin from windfalls. Sloe berries went into gin if you had the bottle. This knowledge of when to pick, where to look, and which part of the plant was edible was not poverty. It was a complete parallel food system running alongside the ration book, invisible to the ministry. A good forager could supplement a family's diet significantly through spring and summer. The skill passed from mother to daughter on the allotment path, through seasons, and none of it was written down in a way that survives. The marble-topped tables, the tiled walls, the fork and spoon, but never a knife. The PIE and mash shop had its own grammar that you either knew from childhood or learned in silence the first time you walked in. The first known shop was Henry Blanchard's in Southwark, which opened in 1844, selling eel pies to dock workers who needed a hot, cheap meal that required no ceremony. The pie used two pastries, suet crust on the base, rough puff on the top, a distinction most modern recipes flatten into one short crust and lose entirely. The liquor was the thing. It was made from the water left after cooking the stewed eels, thickened with flour and finished with chopped parsley, then ladled generously over everything. An intensely savoury green sauce, unlike anything else in British cooking. Many shops now use chicken stock instead of eel water. The people who grew up on the original can taste the difference immediately, without being able to name exactly what is missing. That gap between the original and the substitute is the entire story of what happened to these kitchens, told in one mouthful. There was a window of roughly 3 weeks in late June when the walnut was still soft enough to push a skewer through cleanly before the shell hardened and the moment was gone for another year. The old cooks knew the date by feel, not the calendar. Walnuts were pricked all over, brined for 2 weeks, then dried on racks in the sun until they turned black, which alarmed anyone who had not seen it before, but was exactly right. Then into the jar with spiced malt vinegar, sealed and left for at least a month. Dark, sharp, faintly smoky, nothing like the pale, rubbery pickled walnuts sold in supermarkets, which skipped the sun-drying and cut the brining short. Alongside cold beef or strong cheddar, a proper pickled walnut was, as George Orwell wrote, among the foods that made Britain worth defending. The skill was in the timing. The timing lived in the woman who watched the tree every June and knew, without testing, when the day had come. The Northumberland smokehouses that still cure kippers the old way hang split herrings on tenterhooks over smouldering oak chips for up to 18 hours. Cold smoke, not hot, so the fish dries and colours without cooking through. The colour tells you everything. Deep amber means a long, slow cure. Pale gold means something was hurried, and the brown dye some commercial producers still use means you have been deceived entirely. The technique was formalised in 1843 by John Woodger in Northumberland, though the smoking of herring along that coast goes back much further. You cooked a proper kipper by lowering it into a tall jug of just boiled water and leaving it for 10 minutes. No pan, no fat, no smell filling the kitchen, and the flesh came away in great soft flakes. A poached egg, thick buttered toast, a pot of tea. A working breakfast that happened to be extraordinary. The smokehouses are fewer now, the herring stock's diminished, and the kipper on a supermarket shelf is not the same fish. If the kipper was the ceremonial breakfast, Welsh rarebit was what you made when there was almost nothing left. The earliest known recipe appears in a Welsh manuscript from around 1725, a working-class supper long before restaurant menus discovered it. A strong cheddar melted slowly into dark ale with English mustard and butter, stirred until smooth and glossy, poured over thick toast, then pushed under the grill until it blistered. Not melted cheese on toast. Not the same thing. The ale loosened the protein strands, so the sauce stayed smooth rather than splitting into grease. This was food chemistry. The women who made this nightly understood, even without the vocabulary to name it. The Tuesday night fallback, the end of the week reliable. She could produce it when the cupboard was nearly empty, and it still tasted like she had planned it all along. Nobody makes it like that anymore because nobody has to anymore. You could hear it from the hallway, the steady bubble of the water in the pan, the occasional knock of the pudding basin against the sides, the whole kitchen thick with savoury steam, telling you hours had passed and dinner was close. Steak and kidney pudding, not pie, never pie, meant suet pastry lining a basin filled with diced beef and kidney in thick onion gravy, topped with a suet lid, wrapped in greaseproof and a cloth, tied with string, lowered into boiling water to steam for at least 3 hours. The earliest printed recipe dates to the early 1800s. The suet crust came out thick and yielding, absorbing the gravy from inside, soft where it touched the filling. You turned it out onto a plate, always slightly theatrical, and the gravy ran. The kidney was what separated those who understood the dish from those who tolerated it. You left it in. If you had to ask why, you were not ready to make it. Oxtail soup is believed to have begun in the East End of London in the 17th century, brought into English kitchens by Huguenot refugees who settled in Spitalfields and cooked with the cuts the meat market left behind. The tail was jointed, browned hard in fat, then simmered with root vegetables, a bottle of stout and water to cover for 2 to 3 hours. Fat that rose to the surface was skimmed. The bones stayed in until the last 10 minutes, because the marrow released into the stock gave it a richness nothing else replicated. The result was thick, deeply savoury and gelatinous, the kind of soup that set in the bowl if you left it to cool. A cut so overlooked it was practically free, turned into something that demanded patience and gave back warmth and depth. She made it in the winter. She always made too much, which was the point. Every bowl tasted better than the last, and then she was gone. The secret was lard, and the women who knew it never understood why anyone used anything else. Pure rendered pig fat, chilled hard in the larder, was rubbed into flour with cold fingertips until the mixture looked like rough breadcrumbs. Then the smallest possible amount of cold water was worked in fast, the dough barely touched, wrapped, and rested before rolling. What came out of the oven was shorter and flakier than any butter pastry, holding a filling without going soggy and shattering cleanly under a fork. The health campaigns of the 1980s declared lard dangerous, and most households switched to vegetable shortening. Food scientists have since established that lard contains far less trans fat than the hydrogenated fats that replaced it. The women who made proper short crust never needed a scientist to confirm what they could taste. The pies made with lard held their shape and cut clean. The ones made with substitutes sagged. These kitchens are quiet now. If one of these brought someone back to you, leave their name below.